The town of Providence huddled in the valley like a collection of dropped stones, grey and unmoving against the vast, indifferent canvas of the plains. Its laws were as rigid as its clapboard buildings, its judgments as swift and unyielding as the winter winds that scoured the land. Agnes had lived within its confines for 80 years, a quiet root in its shallow soil. But the town had decided it needed the ground where her small home stood, the last parcel not yet belonging to the mayor's grand vision of expansion. Her refusal was not loud, but it was absolute. It was the refusal of a mountain to be moved by a shovel. For this, she was deemed difficult, then stubborn, then a hindrance to the very notion of progress. Mayor Alastair Finch, a man whose certainty was his shield and his hammer, delivered the verdict himself. He stood on her worn porch, his shadow falling long and dark into her tidy room. He did not shout, his voice was a tool of calm, crushing reason. "Agnes," he had said, his words polished smooth with authority, "the council has decided. For the good of Providence, this plot is needed. We have offered you a room at the boarding house." It is a generous offer. She had looked past him, her gaze fixed on the low, sun-drenched hill to the south, a place the townsfolk called the Scorch. "My husband built this house," she replied, her voice as soft as dust motes in a sunbeam. "My roots are here." The mayor's patience, a famously thin veneer, began to crack. "Your roots are in the past. Providence must look to the future. You will take the room, or you will be outside the charter. The choice is yours. To be outside the charter was to be a ghost, without claim to community, protection, or commerce. It was a sentence of slow, invisible death. The townspeople watched the exchange from their windows and doorways, a silent chorus of agreement. They pitied her, this relic of a bygone time, but their pity was laced with the sharp tang of impatience. Her stubbornness was an inconvenience, an old stone in the middle of a new road. She made her choice without a word, by simply turning back into her home and closing the door on his pronouncement. The next morning, they found her gone, her few belongings bundled on a small handcart she pushed herself. She did not look back. She walked toward the Scorch, the sun-blasted hill no one wanted, a place deemed unfit for man or beast. The place she chose was not remarkable to any eye but her own. It was a gentle slope on the south-facing side of the hill the town called the Scorch, a name born of summer heat and cracked earth. But Agnes saw it not for what it was, but for what it could be. She saw it through the lens of memory, through the long-forgotten lessons of her grandfather, a man who had come from the old country with hands that knew the language of stone and earth. He had taught her to read the land not as a map of possessions, but as a living body. "The earth is a blanket, little one," he used to say, his voice a low rumble. "In winter, you pull it tight around your shoulders." She stood there, her small frame a stark silhouette against the ochre soil, and felt the sun on her face. It was a warm, persistent presence, a promise. This slope would drink in the low winter sun, hoarding its warmth, while the north-facing slopes of the valley would lie in shadow, frozen and brittle. She knelt, her ancient fingers crumbling the dry soil. It was dense, clay-like beneath the dusty top layer. Good. It would hold its shape. It would be her walls and her ceiling. Below the soil, she could feel the faint, solid vibration of stone, the bones of the hill. The town of Providence, a mile distant, was a neat grid of predictable angles. Their homes were towers of cut lumber, standing proud against the sky, defying the elements. They fought the wind, they fought the cold, they fought the heat. They spent their lives in a constant, exhausting battle. Agnes sought not to fight, but to yield. To find the path of least resistance, to nestle into the land instead of standing upon it. She would not build a house against the winter, she would build a house within it, borrowing the strength and insulation of the earth itself. Her plan was a whisper of ancient knowledge in a world that had learned to shout. She would dig. She would carve a space from the hillside itself, a womb in the earth. The front would be open to the sun, a single, watchful eye facing south. The back and sides would be the hill itself, a fortress of soil and rock that no wind could penetrate, no cold could conquer. She spent 3 days just observing, marking the sun's arc from dawn until dusk, feeling the direction of the prevailing winds, listening to the silence of the place. It was a silence the town had forgotten, a silence full of the hum of insects and the rustle of dry grass. The townsfolk, when they bothered to look, saw an old woman sitting on a barren hill, her mind surely snapped by defiance and age. They saw folly. Agnes saw a partnership. She saw the shape of her survival, a shape that had been waiting in this hill for longer than Providence had even existed. The first cut into the earth was an act of faith. Her shovel was old, the wooden handle worn smooth by the hands of her husband, and its steel edge was dull. But it was strong. The sun beat down on her back as she broke the dry crust of the land. The sound was a lonely scrape, the only man-made noise for a mile in any direction. The people of Providence, when their daily chores brought them to the edge of town, would sometimes pause and stare up at the hill. They saw the small, stooped figure, a speck of grey against the brown earth, moving with a slowness that seemed impossibly arduous. Pity and scorn mingled in their thoughts. She digs her own grave, one would mutter to another, and the sentiment would ripple through the town, solidifying into accepted truth. But Agnes was not digging a grave, she was shaping a life. Each shovelful of earth was heavy, a dead weight that strained the thin muscles of her arms and the brittle architecture of her spine. The work was brutally slow. An hour of labor might deepen the hole by only a few inches. She did not rush. Her movements were a study in economy, born of a body that had no energy to waste. She learned the rhythm of the work, drive the shovel with her foot, lever the handle, lift the soil, turn, and deposit it to the side, creating a growing mound that would later serve as a berm, a protective lip for her dwelling. Days bled into one another, marked only by the sun's passage. Her hands, once soft from a lifetime of mending and baking, became raw, then calloused. A deep ache settled into her lower back, a constant, dull companion. Yet, with every scoop of earth, a sense of purpose grew within her. This was not the mindless toil of a prisoner, it was the deliberate craft of a creator. She was not merely removing dirt, she was revealing the home that was already there, hidden within the hill. As she dug deeper, the soil changed. The dry, crumbly topsoil gave way to a rich, dense clay, cool to the touch even in the afternoon heat. This was the heart of the hill. It held the memory of ancient rains. It was the material her grandfather had spoken of, the stuff that could be shaped and dried by the sun into bricks of iron-hard adobe. She began to separate the soils, creating one pile of the loose topsoil for her future garden, and another of the heavy clay. The whole grew, no longer a mere depression but a recognizable space, a rectangular cut into the world, 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide. It began to take on the character of a room, a sanctuary from the wind that swept ceaselessly across the open prairie. Even now, standing at its bottom, she could feel the air was calmer, the sun's heat more focused. The town saw a hole. Agnes saw a foundation. They saw an old woman's madness. She felt the steady, quiet pulse of forgotten wisdom beating back to life through the handle of her shovel. With the space excavated, the true architecture began. The back wall of her dwelling was the hill itself, a sheer face of compacted earth and stone. For the side and front walls, she would need more. She became a gatherer, a scavenger of the plains. Her days were now spent walking, her eyes cast downward, reading the landscape for its hidden offerings. She looked for stones, not the great, unmovable boulders, but the flat, manageable slabs of sandstone and limestone that littered the gullies and dry creek beds. Each one was a treasure. She would pry them loose with her shovel, her hands finding purchase on their rough surfaces. Getting them back to her sight was a slow, grueling procession. She had no beast of burden, only her own failing strength. She would roll the larger stones end over end, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her progress measured in inches. The smaller ones she could carry, 2 at a time, cradled in her arms like difficult children. The weight bore down on her, but her resolve was inflexible. The town watched this new phase of her madness with a kind of morbid fascination. They saw her, a tiny figure in the vast landscape, wrestling with the bones of the earth. It was a pathetic, heroic, and utterly baffling spectacle. She builds a rock pile, Mayor Finch declared to the town council, his voice thick with derision. Let her have her folly. Winter will be the final judgment. Agnes paid them no mind. Her world had shrunk to the hill, the stones, and the sun. She began to lay the walls, using the thick, wet clay she had excavated as a mortar. It was a slow, deliberate process, more like sculpture than construction. She did not work with plumb lines or levels, but with her hands and her eyes, feeling for the right fit, the most stable placement. One stone was laid upon another, the clay packed tightly into the gaps, squeezing out to form a rough but airtight seal. She remembered her grandfather's words, "A stone wall is a conversation between the stones." You must listen to what they want. She listened. She learned the weight and balance of each rock, how a small, wedge-shaped stone could secure a large, unstable one. The walls rose slowly, a mosaic of earthy reds, pale grays, and sandy yellows. They were thick, nearly 2 feet from inside to out, not just for strength, but for mass. This was the core of the principle, thermal mass. The thick stone walls would act as a battery for heat. During the day, they would slowly absorb the sun's energy, and at night, as the air grew cold, they would radiate that stored warmth back into the living space. Her home would not be heated by fire alone, it would be heated by the memory of the sun. The town, in their wooden houses with their thin walls, could not comprehend this. They saw a crude, primitive hovel. They saw weakness. They did not see the deep, elemental strength she was building, stone by patient stone. The 4 walls, 3 of stone and 1 of earth, now defined a space. But it was a space open to the sky, vulnerable. It needed a roof, and it needed a heart. For the roof, she needed timber. She did not take an axe to the few struggling cottonwoods in the valley, that was the way of the town, to take what was living. Instead, she foraged for what was already dead. She walked for miles along the creek beds, searching for fallen trees from past seasons, their wood seasoned by the sun and wind. She found them, great silvered trunks half buried in sand, and began the arduous task of cutting them to length with a small, rusty handsaw. The work was exhausting, the rhythmic rasp of the saw a counterpoint to her own ragged breathing. She could not carry the heavy beams, she dragged them, one by one, back to her hillside, leaving a long, deep scar in the dust. It took weeks. With the main beams finally in place, resting on the thick stone walls, she created the roof's surface from a lattice of smaller branches, overlaid with prairie grass, and finally sealed with a thick, 6-inch layer of the same clay she'd used for mortar. It was an earthen roof, a living roof, an extension of the hill itself. Now, for the heart. Every dwelling needed a hearth, a source of fire for cooking and supplemental warmth. This could not be a simple fire pit. The smoke needed a path out, and the heat needed to be directed in. She set about building a fireplace in the west wall, a task requiring more precision than the main walls. She selected the flattest, most uniform stones, fitting them together with painstaking care. She built a deep firebox, a tapered throat to draw the air, and a smoke shelf to prevent downdrafts. This was knowledge passed down not in books, but in practice, a kind of physical inheritance. The chimney was the most difficult part. She had to build it up through the earthen roof, a column of carefully interlocking stones, each one hauled up a makeshift ramp. As she laid the final stone, silhouetted against the setting sun, a figure appeared at the bottom of the hill. It was Mayor Finch. He had walked from the town, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of stern curiosity. He surveyed the structure, a half-buried mound of earth and rock with a crude stone chimney poking out. He did not come closer. He simply called up to her, his voice carrying on the evening air. "The first snows will be here in a month, old woman. That thing will be your tomb." Agnes paused, her hand resting on the final, cool stone of the chimney. She looked down at him, a man so certain in his world of straight lines and cut lumber. She did not reply with words. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, then turned back to her work, leaving him standing alone in the long shadows. With the shelter complete, a low, solid presence half swallowed by the hillside, Agnes turned her attention inward. The final, crucial element of her survival was not stone or wood, but life itself. The southern face of her dwelling was not a solid wall. She had left a wide opening, which she now covered with a frame of scavenged wood and translucent, thinly scraped animal hide she had prepared years ago and kept. They were not as clear as the panes in the town's windows, but they would let in the light. And light was everything. Inside, along this south-facing wall, she built a long, shallow trough of wood and filled it with the rich topsoil she had so carefully set aside months before. This was her garden, her pantry, her pharmacy. Here, protected from the wind and the coming frost, she planted the seeds she had carried with her: hardy greens, resilient root vegetables, and pungent herbs. The principles were simple. The low winter sun would stream through the hide-covered opening, its rays falling directly onto the garden bed. The surrounding thermal mass of the earth and stone walls would maintain a stable, cool temperature, preventing a hard freeze. While the world outside would be barren and locked in ice, here, in this small pocket of ingenuity, life would persist. She worked tirelessly to prepare for the long siege of winter. She gathered and stacked what little firewood she could find, not to heat her home. The sun and earth would do most oft work, but for cooking and for the coldest, darkest nights. She set snares for small game, using the skills her husband had taught her. She harvested wild roots and dried the last of the season's berries. Her stores were meager by the town standards. Providence was a fortress of abundance. Their cellars were overflowing with sacks of flour, barrels of salted pork, and preserves from the summer's harvest. Their woodpiles were small mountains of fuel, ready to be fed into the insatiable appetites of their iron stoves. Their preparations were a show of force, a testament to their dominion over the land. Agnes's preparations were a quiet act of cooperation. Her wealth was not in what she had stockpiled, but in the resilience of her system. Her home was not a container for supplies, it was a living, breathing part of the landscape, designed to sustain itself. One afternoon, as a chill wind began to blow from the north, carrying the first scent of snow, she saw two women from the town walking the perimeter of her hill. They stopped and pointed, their whispers carried on the wind. They saw the strange, half-buried structure, the murky light filtering through the hide windows. They saw an old woman tending a box of dirt inside a cave. They shook their heads, pulling their shawls tighter, and hurried back to the warmth and safety of their solid, respectable, and profoundly vulnerable wooden homes. The first snow came not as a storm, but as a gentle apology from the sky. Fat, silent flakes drifted down, blanketing the brown landscape in a layer of pristine white. In Providence, the sight was met with a sense of cozy satisfaction. Fires were lit in every hearth, the smoke rising from the town's chimneys in straight, confident columns. The townsfolk settled in for winter, secure in their preparations, their sturdy homes a bulwark against the coming cold. Inside her earth-sheltered home, Agnes watched the snow fall through the translucent hides. The light in her dwelling grew softer, more diffuse. A profound quiet descended, the blanket of snow muffling the outside world. The air inside was cool, but not cold. It was the steady, unwavering coolness of a cellar, a stark contrast to the biting air outside. The thick, earthen walls, having soaked in months of autumn sun, now began to slowly, imperceptibly, release their stored warmth. It was not the aggressive, drying heat of a wood stove, but a gentle, ambient warmth that radiated from the very structure of the home. She lit a small fire in her hearth, more for the cheer of its light and for simmering a pot of root stew than for heat. The smoke drew perfectly up the chimney, a thin, almost invisible wisp against the grey sky. Days passed, and the cold deepened. The snow on her roof did not melt and refreeze, as it did on the wooden roofs in town. Instead, it stayed, a thick, pristine blanket. It was no longer a burden, but another layer of insulation, a gift from the storm. Her indoor garden thrived. The kale and chard grew lush and green, an impossible splash of summer in the dead of winter. The herbs filled the small space with their sharp, clean scent. She was warm. She was fed. She was at peace. From her hillside, she could see the town below. It looked like a child's drawing, the houses neat and orderly. But she saw something else. She saw the ceaseless plumes of smoke pouring from their chimneys. She knew what that smoke represented, a frantic, constant consumption of fuel. Each house was a small, leaky box fighting a losing war against the vast, encroaching cold, a war fought with the finite resource of their woodpiles. They were burning through their survival, log by log. Her home, in contrast, asked for very little. It worked in concert with the season, using the sun's light, the earth's mass, and the snow's insulation. It was a system of elegant efficiency. The town saw her as a destitute outcast. But as the winter clenched its fist, Agnes knew, with a quiet certainty that had no need for pride, that she was the richest person in the entire valley. The great blizzard did not announce itself. It arrived in the dead of night, a sudden, violent escalation of the winter's fury. The wind, a living thing, screamed down from the north, a physical presence that slammed against the walls of Providence. It tore at shingles, rattled window frames, and forced its icy fingers through every crack and crevice in the wooden houses. The snow was no longer made of gentle flakes, but of fine, hard pellets, driven horizontally, scouring the landscape and burying everything in its path. Inside their homes, the people of Providence huddled by their stoves, feeding them constantly. The wind howled with a demonic voice, and the houses groaned under the assault. The temperature plummeted to depths no one could remember. The battle for warmth became desperate. The woodpiles, which had seemed so immense, dwindled at an alarming rate. In Agnes's earth shelter, the storm was a distant rumor. The wind shrieked and howled far above her earthen roof, but inside, there was only a deep, resonant silence. The sheer mass of the hill absorbed the storm's violence. Not a single draft penetrated her walls. The temperature inside remained steady, cool but life-sustaining. She kept her small fire going, the stones of the hearth radiating a comforting warmth. She ate a simple meal of steamed greens from her garden and a piece of smoked rabbit. She was entirely disconnected from the chaos unfolding just a mile away. For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard raged without pause. In Providence, the situation turned catastrophic. The first roof collapsed under the immense weight of the snow, its timbers cracking with a sound like a gunshot. Then another. Panic began to set in. Families abandoned their failing homes, trying to reach the relative safety of the stone-built town hall, only to be turned back by chest-deep drifts and a wind that stole the breath from their lungs. Firewood ran out. The insatiable stoves fell cold and silent. The frost began to crawl up the inside of the walls, a beautiful, deadly frost that heralded the end. The town's bell, which was rung in times of emergency, began to toll, its desperate peal a cry for help against the storm's roar. Then, abruptly, it stopped, its rope likely frozen or broken. A terrible silence fell over the town, a silence far more frightening than the storm itself. Agnes, safe in her burrow, knew nothing of this. She slept, she ate, she tended her plants, living in a separate reality, a small island of temperate calm in an ocean of lethal cold. The wisdom of her grandfather, the simple, powerful truths of the earth, had built her an ark. When the storm finally broke, the world was remade. A brilliant, merciless sun shone down on a landscape of impossible white. The snow lay in immense, sculpted drifts, 10, 15 feet deep. The town of Providence was gone, buried. Only the tops of a few roofs and the steeple of the meeting hall were visible, stark and black against the snow. It was a scene of utter devastation, silent and still. From Agnes's chimney, a thin, pale tendril of smoke rose into the crystalline air. It was the only sign of human life for miles. A young man, barely 20, stumbled through the snow. He was the mayor's son, Thomas. His face was frostbitten, his eyes wide with horror. Their roof had collapsed, and he had managed to crawl out, the sole survivor of his family in that house. He had been wandering aimlessly, delirious with cold and grief, when he saw the smoke. It seemed impossible, a phantom. He staggered toward it, falling and crawling, driven by the last flicker of instinct. He reached the hillside and saw the impossible, a doorway cut into a snowdrift, a faint, warm light glowing from within. He collapsed at the entrance. Agnes heard the sound and opened her door. She saw the boy, half frozen and insensible, and without a word, dragged him inside. She stripped off his frozen clothes and wrapped him in the simple wool blanket she had. She spoon-fed him warm broth, the steam rising from the bowl like a prayer. He was the first. Soon, another appeared, a mother clutching a child, their faces masks of bluish ice. They had seen the smoke, too. They had followed the ghost. Agnes took them in. Her small home, no bigger than a single room in one of the town's grander houses, became a sanctuary. As the day wore on, more survivors found their way to her door, a ragged, frozen procession of the damned. They were the ones who had been lucky enough to escape their collapsing, freezing homes. Among the last to arrive was Mayor Alastair Finch. He was a broken man. His fine coat was torn, his face a ruin of grief and disbelief. He had lost everything, his home, his wife, his certainty. He stood in the doorway of Agnes's home, the dwelling he had called a tomb, and stared. He saw the impossible warmth, the faint green of the garden, the dozen or so survivors huddled together, alive. His eyes met Agnes's. All the arrogance, all the authority, had been scoured from him. "How?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Agnes looked at him, her gaze holding no triumph, no resentment, only a deep, sorrowful compassion. She ladled a bowl of stew from the pot simmering on the hearth. "You were fighting the winter," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the hushed room. She held out the bowl to him. "I just asked it for shelter." He took the bowl, his hands trembling, and the proud, certain man finally wept. In the weeks that followed, Agnes's earthen home became the heart of a new community. It was a hospital, a kitchen, and a council hall for the handful of survivors. They huddled together in the steady warmth, sharing the food from her impossible garden and the small stores she had gathered. The old hierarchies of Providence were gone, buried under the snow along with the houses and the pride of the people who had built them. Mayor Finch, now just Alastair, was a quiet, humbled man. He watched Agnes, studied her ways, and listened. He learned. When the great thaw finally came and the grim task of digging out the town began, the survivors did not speak of rebuilding what was lost. They spoke of building what would last. They had seen the catastrophic failure of their own wisdom and the profound success of the wisdom they had dismissed. They came to Agnes, not as a pariah, but as a teacher. They asked her to show them how to read the land, how to place a home to welcome the sun, how to build with the earth and stone that was freely available. The work of rebuilding began, but it was different now. They did not impose a rigid grid upon the valley. They followed the contours of the land. They dug into the south-facing slopes, creating new homes modeled after Agnes's ark, dwellings that were not in opposition to the world, but a part of it. The folly on the hill had become the blueprint for survival. The lone outcast had become the founder of a new way of life, one built not on dominance, but on partnership. The community that grew from the ashes of Providence was smaller, quieter, but its roots were deeper, anchored in the ancient, simple wisdom that an old woman had refused to forget. How often do we build our lives like the houses of Providence, standing tall and defiant against the inevitable storms? We build with pride, with the conventional wisdom of our time, certain in our methods, dismissing the quiet, unconventional voices that speak of a different way. We value the complex over the simple, the new over the ancient, the loud over the still. We fight against the world, trying to bend it to our will, exhausting our resources in a constant battle against the very nature of things. And then the blizzards come. They come in the form of personal loss, of economic collapse, of spiritual crisis, of a world changing in ways we cannot control. Our proud structures, which seemed so strong, are proven to be brittle. Our certainty shatters. Our vast stores of what we thought was important are shown to be useless against the penetrating cold of reality. In those moments, we are left to search for a different kind of shelter, a different kind of wisdom. Perhaps that wisdom is not in building higher walls, but in digging deeper foundations. Perhaps it lies not in fighting the storm, but in finding the quiet, sheltered place within it. Perhaps the answers we seek are not in the grand pronouncements of the powerful, but in the patient, steady work of those who have been cast out, those who listen to the forgotten whispers of the earth. What hillside is waiting for you? What quiet, ancestral knowledge have you dismissed as folly? What if the greatest strength you can build is not the one that stands against the world, but the one that makes itself a part of it?